The gunshot that cracked through the winter air sent Adelaide Lancaster's horse into a blind panic, and before she could grip the reins tight enough, the mare had thrown her sideways toward the edge of a cliff she hadn't even known was there. Her scream tore from her throat as her gloved hands clawed at frozen rock and scraped uselessly against ice-slicked stone, her body sliding down the steep embankment with terrifying speed. The world became a blur of white snow and gray sky, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst right through her ribs. She managed to catch hold of a twisted juniper root protruding from the cliff face, her fingers wrapping around it with desperate strength, even as the rest of her body swung out over empty space. The wind howled around her, cutting through her wool coat like it was nothing more than paper, and when she dared to look down, all she could see was a dizzying drop into a snow-filled ravine that seemed to have no bottom. Her arms trembled with the strain of holding her entire weight, and she could feel the root beginning to give way, tiny pieces of frozen earth crumbling and falling past her face. This was how she was going to die, she thought with sudden terrible clarity. Frozen and alone on a mountain pass outside Delta, Colorado, in the winter of 1884, because she had been foolish enough to think she could make the journey to her uncle's ranch by herself. Her father had warned her about traveling alone through the San Juan Mountains in December, but Adelaide had been so determined to prove her independence, so eager to escape the suffocating expectations of her life in Denver, that she had dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. Now those concerns seemed prophetic. "Hold on," the voice came from above, rough and urgent and entirely unexpected. Adelaide jerked her head up, causing a fresh shower of ice and dirt to cascade down around her. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the silhouette of a man on horseback at the top of the cliff, already swinging down from his saddle with swift, efficient movements. "Don't move, just keep holding on." "I don't have much choice," she managed to gasp out, though she wasn't sure if he could hear her over the wind. Her fingers were going numb inside her gloves, and she could feel the juniper root shifting ominously in the frozen soil. Every second felt like an eternity, each breath a small victory against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The cowboy moved with purpose, dropping to his stomach at the edge of the cliff, and reaching down toward her with one arm while the other gripped what looked like a rope he had tied around a boulder. He was still too far away, the distance between his outstretched hand and her desperate position, a gap of at least 6 feet. Adelaide watched as he pulled himself back up, her hope deflating like a punctured balloon. But then she saw him doing something with the rope, fashioning a loop and testing its strength with sharp tugs. "I'm going to lower this down to you," he called, his voice cutting through the wind with authoritative clarity. "When it reaches you, you need to get it around your body under your arms. Can you do that?" Adelaide looked at her hands, both of them clutched around the root with white-knuckled desperation, and tried to imagine letting go with even one of them. The very thought made her stomach drop. "I don't know," she shouted back, her voice cracking with fear and cold. "You can," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her believe him, some quality of absolute certainty that cut through her panic like a knife through butter. "I'm not going to let you fall, I promise you that." The rope came down slowly, swaying in the wind, and Adelaide watched it descend with her heart in her throat. When it finally reached her level, dangling just a foot to her right, she had to make a choice. Stay as she was and wait for the root to give way entirely, or take the risk and reach for the rope. Her left hand was already going numb, the fingers barely responding to her commands, and she knew she couldn't hold on much longer regardless. "That's it," the cowboy encouraged from above as she slowly, carefully unwrapped her left hand from the root. Her entire body weight shifted to her right arm, and she felt the sickening lurch as the root dipped lower, but it held. She reached for the rope, her hand shaking so badly she nearly missed it on the first try, but then her fingers closed around the rough hemp, and she held on with everything she had. Now get it around you. Take your time, but move steady. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. Every movement felt like it might be the one that sent her plummeting into the ravine below, but Adelaide forced herself to focus on the task, blocking out everything else. She got the loop around her back, then under her right arm, working with fingers that felt more like blocks of wood than actual body parts. When she finally had it secured around her torso, she called up to the cowboy with what little breath she had left. "It's on. Good girl. Now when I tell you, let go of that root and hold onto the rope with both hands. I've got you secured up here. You're not going to fall." Adelaide looked down one more time at the endless white below her and felt her resolve waver. But the root chose that moment to shift again, a more pronounced movement that sent her heart into her throat, and she knew she was out of time. "Okay," she called up. "I'm ready. Let go, now." She released the root, and for one terrible, eternal second she was falling. But then the rope caught and held, jerking her to a stop so abruptly that she swung forward and crashed against the cliff face. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, but she barely noticed because she wasn't falling anymore. She was suspended in the air, held by nothing but hemp rope and the strength of a stranger she had never even seen properly. "I've got you," the cowboy called down, and then she felt herself being pulled upward, inch by inch. It was slow going, and Adelaide tried to help by using her feet against the cliff face, but her legs were shaking too badly to be of much use. Still, the man above kept pulling with steady, relentless strength, and gradually the edge of the cliff came closer. When she was finally near enough, he reached down and grabbed her wrist with his free hand, his grip like iron, and hauled her up and over the edge with one powerful pull. Adelaide collapsed onto solid ground, her entire body shaking with cold and shock and relief so intense it made her dizzy. She lay there in the snow, gasping for breath, barely able to process the fact that she was alive. The cowboy was beside her immediately, his hands checking her over with quick professional efficiency. "Are you hurt? Can you move your arms and legs?" She managed a nod, then found her voice. "I think so. Yes, I'm okay." He sat back on his heels, and Adelaide got her first clear look at her rescuer. He was somewhere in his mid-20s, with dark hair that stuck out from under his hat and striking blue eyes that stood out sharply against his tanned, weather-worn face. There was a scrape on his cheek that was bleeding slightly, though he didn't seem to notice or care. His expression was serious, focused, but she could see the relief in his eyes as he looked her over. "That was too close," he said, his voice rough. "What in God's name are you doing out here alone in weather like this?" Before Adelaide could answer, another gunshot cracked through the air, and the cowboy immediately threw himself over her, shielding her body with his own. She felt rather than heard his sharp intake of breath, felt the tension coil through his muscles as he scanned the snowy landscape around them. When no more shots followed, he carefully lifted his head, his eyes narrowed against the wind. "Who's shooting at you?" he demanded, his tone leaving no room for evasion. "I don't know," Adelaide said honestly, her fear returning in a cold rush. "I was riding through the pass when someone started shooting. My horse panicked and threw me toward the cliff. I never even saw who it was." The cowboy cursed under his breath and pulled her to her feet with one smooth motion. "We need to get off this mountain. Can you ride?" "Yes, but my horse ran off. You'll ride with me." He was already moving toward his own horse, a solid-looking bay gelding that stood waiting patiently despite the wind and gunfire. The cowboy grabbed the saddle horn and swung up, then reached down for Adelaide. "Come on. We don't have time to waste if someone's shooting at you." Adelaide let him pull her up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist because there was nowhere else to hold on. The warmth of his body was shocking after the terrible cold of hanging from that cliff, and she found herself pressing closer to him without thinking about it. He seemed not to notice or care, already urging his horse forward at a pace that was just short of reckless given the icy conditions. They rode hard for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 30 minutes, following a narrow trail that wound down through the mountains with heart-stopping drops on one side. The cowboy guided his horse with sure confidence, never hesitating even when the path seemed to disappear entirely under the snow. Adelaide held on and tried not to think about how much she was trusting this stranger with her life, tried not to wonder if she had escaped one death only to find another. But no more shots came, and gradually the terrain began to level out as they descended from the high country. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, coating everything in white and making it hard to see more than a few yards ahead. Adelaide was shivering uncontrollably now, the cold having seeped so deep into her bones that she wasn't sure she would ever be warm again. "There's a lined shack about a mile from here," the cowboy said over his shoulder, having to raise his voice to be heard over the wind. "We'll hole up there until this storm passes. You need to get warm and dry before you catch your death." Adelaide nodded against his back, too cold to form words. She could feel exhaustion pulling at her, the aftermath of terror, and the physical strain of hanging from that cliff catching up with her all at once. Her eyelids felt heavy, and it would be so easy to just close them and rest for a moment. "Hey." The cowboy's voice was sharp, cutting through her drowsiness. "Don't fall asleep on me. Stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me your name." "Adelaide," she mumbled. "Adelaide Lancaster." "I'm Xander Lawson," he said. "Where were you headed?" "Adelaide Lancaster, my uncle's ranch." "The Triple Bar, outside Delta. Do you know it?" "I know it. That's still a good 20 miles from here, and you weren't going to make it in this storm even if you hadn't nearly fallen off a cliff." There was a note of reproach in his voice, but also something else. Concern, maybe. "What possessed you to try crossing the mountains alone in December?" "I didn't think it would be this bad," Adelaide admitted, feeling foolish. "The weather was clear when I left Montrose this morning, and I can take care of myself. Usually." She felt more than heard his snort of disbelief. "Usually doesn't count for much when you're dangling off a cliff or being shot at by unknown assailants." Adelaide wanted to argue, but she was too tired and cold to muster the energy. Instead, she just held on tighter and let Xander guide them through the storm. True to his word, they reached a small cabin within the mile, a rough structure that looked barely large enough for 2 people but was the most beautiful thing Adelaide had ever seen. Xander dismounted and helped her down, keeping one arm around her waist when her legs threatened to give out. "Easy now. Let's get you inside." The cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter from the wind and snow, and that alone made it paradise. Xander settled Adelaide onto a rough wooden bench near a small stone fireplace, then immediately set about building a fire with swift, practiced movements. Within minutes, flames were crackling to life, and Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes at the sight. "Get out of that wet coat," Xander ordered, shrugging out of his own heavy sheepskin jacket and hanging it on a peg near the door. "There should be some blankets in that chest over there." Adelaide tried to unbutton her coat, but her fingers wouldn't cooperate. They were still too cold, too clumsy, and frustration welled up inside her as she fumbled uselessly with the buttons. Xander noticed her struggle and came over, kneeling in front of her. "Let me," he said quietly, and began working the buttons free with deft fingers. His touch was impersonal, efficient, but Adelaide still felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire creeping up her neck. When he had the coat off, he reached for the blankets and wrapped them around her shoulders, tucking them in with gentle care that seemed at odds with his rough exterior. "Thank you," Adelaide whispered, meeting his eyes for the first time since they had reached the cabin. Up close, they were even more striking, a deep blue that reminded her of mountain lakes in summer. "For everything. For saving my life." Xander's expression softened slightly, some of the hard edges smoothing out. "You don't need to thank me for that. Any decent person would have done the same." "But you risked everything," Adelaide insisted, thinking of how he had climbed out over that cliff, how one wrong move could have sent them both plummeting into the ravine. "You could have been killed." Xander held her gaze, and something shifted in his eyes, something warm and intense that made Adelaide's breath catch in her chest. "You're worth it," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that Adelaide didn't quite understand but felt all the way down to her bones. Before she could think of how to respond, Xander stood and turned away, busying himself with checking the cabin's meager supplies. Adelaide watched him move around the small space, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere and saved her life without hesitation, and felt something unfamiliar and unsettling bloom in her chest. The storm continued to rage outside, and inside the small cabin, Adelaide Lancaster and Xander Lawson settled in to wait it out, neither of them aware that this chance meeting on a snowy mountain pass would change both their lives forever. As the fire grew stronger, Adelaide gradually stopped shivering and began to feel human again. Xander had found a tin of coffee and a battered pot, and was heating water over the flames with the patient focus of someone who had spent a lot of time taking care of himself in rough conditions. The smell of brewing coffee filled the small cabin, mixing with the wood smoke, and Adelaide breathed it in gratefully. "Here." Xander handed her a tin cup filled with steaming black coffee. "It's not much, but it'll warm you up from the inside." Adelaide wrapped her hands around the cup, savoring the heat that seeped into her palms, and took a careful sip. The coffee was bitter and strong, but it was hot, and that was all that mattered. "It's perfect," she said honestly. "Thank you." Xander settled onto the floor across from her, his back against the wall, and nursed his own cup of coffee. In the firelight, Adelaide could see him more clearly, could take in the strong line of his jaw, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his dark hair curled slightly at his collar. He looked tired, she realized, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of a hard life lived and survived. "So you're a cowboy?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Ranch hand," he corrected with a slight smile. "I work for the bar about 15 miles south of here. We winter some cattle up in these mountains, and I was checking on them when I heard that gunshot." His expression turned serious. "Any idea who might want to shoot at you?" Adelaide shook her head, wrapping the blanket more tightly around herself. "No one. I can't imagine why anyone would. I don't know anyone out here except my uncle, and I haven't even seen him in 5 years." "What's his name?" "Your uncle, Marcus Lancaster. He owns the Triple Bar." Xander's eyebrows rose slightly. "Marcus Lancaster is your uncle. I know him. Good man, fair boss. He talks about his niece back in Denver sometimes, says she's too smart and stubborn for her own good." The corner of his mouth twitched. "I'm starting to think he was right about that." Despite everything, Adelaide found herself smiling. He would say that. He and my father are very much alike in their opinions of what women should and shouldn't do. And traveling alone through mountain passes in winter storms is on the shouldn't do list. Very much so. Adelaide took another sip of coffee, feeling warmth spread through her chest. But I'm 22 years old, not a child. I should be able to travel where I want without a male escort. Should be and reality are two different things out here, Xander said quietly. The frontier's getting more settled, sure, but it's still dangerous. And not just from weather and cliffs. There are outlaws, claim jumpers, drifters looking for easy targets. He paused, his expression darkening. And apparently someone with a rifle who doesn't mind taking shots at lone travelers. The reminder sent a chill through Adelaide that had nothing to do with the cold. Do you think they were specifically targeting me, or was it just random? Hard to say. Could have been someone hoping to rob you, saw a lone rider and figured you'd be easy pickings. Could have been someone with a grudge against your uncle trying to send a message. Xander set his cup down and leaned forward slightly. Have there been any disputes involving the Triple Bar lately? Land disagreements, water rights, that sort of thing? I don't know. Like I said, I haven't seen Uncle Marcus in years. We've exchanged letters, but he never mentioned any trouble. Adelaide bit her lip, worry gnawing at her. Do you think he's in some kind of danger? I haven't heard anything about trouble at the Triple Bar, and word travels fast in these parts. But it wouldn't hurt to be cautious until we figure out what happened up there. Xander stood and moved to the cabin's single small window, peering out into the white curtain of falling snow. Storm's getting worse. We'll be stuck here at least until morning. The reality of the situation settled over Adelaide. She was going to spend the night in a tiny cabin with a man she had just met, miles from anywhere, in the middle of a blizzard. Her mother would have fainted at the impropriety of it all. But her mother wasn't here, and Adelaide was alive only because of Xander Lawson's quick action and courage. Propriety seemed like a small concern compared to that. I don't mind, she said softly. Being stuck here, I mean. It's better than the alternative. Xander turned from the window and looked at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. You should try to get some rest. There's a cot in the corner, nothing fancy, but it's better than the floor. What about you? I'll be fine by the fire. I've slept in worse places. Adelaide wanted to argue, to insist that they share the cot, or that she would take the floor, but the exhaustion was pulling at her too strongly. Her entire body ached from the ordeal, and her eyes felt like they had sand in them. She nodded and moved to the cot, which was indeed nothing fancy, just a wooden frame with a thin mattress and a couple of worn blankets. But it felt like heaven as she lay down, still wrapped in the blankets Xander had given her. Xander, she called softly as he settled back down by the fire. Yeah, thank you for everything. I truly don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along when you did. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough. Try not to think about it. You're safe now, that's all that matters. Adelaide closed her eyes and let sleep take her, feeling safer than she had any right to feel given the circumstances. Her last conscious thought was of bright blue eyes and a voice saying with absolute certainty, "You're worth it." She woke to pale gray light filtering through the cabin's small window and the smell of something cooking. For a moment, Adelaide was disoriented, unsure of where she was or why she was sleeping in her clothes. But then memory came flooding back and she sat up quickly, her heart racing. Xander was crouched by the fire, stirring something in a small pot. He looked up when he heard her move and gave her a slight nod. Morning. Storm finally broke about an hour ago. I found some beans and jerky in the supplies if you're hungry. Adelaide realized she was starving. She hadn't eaten since breakfast the previous day, and that seemed like a lifetime ago now. I'm very hungry, actually. They ate in companionable silence, the simple food tasting better than anything Adelaide could remember having in recent memory. When they were finished, Xander stood and began gathering their few belongings, preparing to leave. "We should head out soon if you're feeling up to it. Your uncle's probably worried sick about you, and the longer we wait, the more snow we'll have to deal with." Adelaide nodded and stood, testing her legs. They were sore and stiff, but they held her weight without trouble. "I'm ready." Outside, the world had been transformed into a pristine white landscape, beautiful and treacherous in equal measure. Xander's horse was standing in the small lean-to beside the cabin, apparently none the worse for wear after the previous day's adventures. Xander saddled him quickly, then helped Adelaide mount behind him again. The ride to the Triple Bar took most of the morning, following trails that were nearly invisible under the fresh snow. Xander seemed to navigate by instinct, never hesitating even when Adelaide couldn't see any clear path forward. She held on to him and tried not to think too much about how aware she was of his presence, of the solid warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. They talked as they rode, small conversations that helped pass the time and distracted Adelaide from her sore muscles and lingering fear. She learned that Xander had come west from Missouri 5 years ago, looking for a fresh start after his parents died. He had worked on various ranches throughout Colorado, learning the cattle business from the ground up, and had been with the Bar M for the past 2 years. He spoke little about his past beyond the bare facts, but Adelaide sensed there were stories there he wasn't ready to tell. For her part, Adelaide told him about growing up in Denver, about her father's successful dry goods business and her mother's never-ending campaign to marry her off to a suitable young man from a good family. She told him about the suffocating feeling of being trapped in a life that had been planned out for her since birth, and how she had finally convinced her parents to let her visit Uncle Marcus with the hope of finding something different, something more. "And have you?" Xander asked. "Found something different?" Adelaide thought about hanging from a cliff in a blizzard while someone shot at her, about spending the night in a lined shack with a cowboy she had just met, about feeling more alive and terrified and awake than she had in years. "Yes," she said quietly, "I think I have." When the buildings of the Triple Bar finally came into view, Adelaide felt a confusing mixture of relief and regret. Relief that they had made it safely, that she would soon see her uncle and be able to reassure him she was all right. But regret, too, because it meant this strange, intense interlude with Xander Lawson was coming to an end. They rode into the ranch yard and were immediately surrounded by ranch hands and one very agitated older man who Adelaide recognized from old photographs as her Uncle Marcus. He was at her side before Xander had even brought his horse to a complete stop, reaching up to help her down with hands that shook slightly. "Adelaide, thank God. When your wire said you'd be here yesterday afternoon and you never arrived, I thought." He trailed off, seeming unable to voice what he had thought. His eyes, the same gray as Adelaide's own, were bright with emotion. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "I'm all right, Uncle Marcus. Thanks to Mr. Lawson here." Adelaide gestured to Xander, who had dismounted and was standing beside his horse with his hat in his hands. "He saved my life." What followed was a confused jumble of explanations and questions, with everyone talking over each other until Marcus finally held up his hand for silence. "Come inside, all of you. Adelaide, you need food and rest. Xander, you'll stay and tell me exactly what happened." They gathered in Marcus's study, a warm room lined with books and smelling of leather and pipe tobacco. Adelaide sank into a chair near the fireplace, while Xander remained standing, giving Marcus a concise account of the previous day's events. Adelaide watched her uncle's face grow increasingly grave as Xander described the gunshot, the cliff, the second shot as they were leaving. "And you're certain it was aimed at Adelaide?" Marcus asked when Xander had finished. No way to be certain, but it seemed deliberate. First shot spooked her horse right when she was near the cliff edge, and the second came after I'd pulled her up. If someone was just hunting or firing randomly, the timing was awfully convenient. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the arm of his chair in a gesture Adelaide remembered from childhood. Finally, he spoke. "There's been some trouble around here lately." Nothing that seemed serious, but now I'm wondering if I should have paid more attention to it. "What kind of trouble?" Adelaide asked. "There's a man named Silas Crenshaw who's been buying up land in the area, trying to piece together a large holding. He made me an offer for the triple bar about 2 months ago, and I turned him down flat. Since then, there have been some incidents. Fences cut, a few head of cattle gone missing, that sort of thing. I thought it was just bad luck or maybe some drifter causing mischief, but if he's escalated to taking shots at my niece..." Marcus's expression turned hard. "That's a different matter entirely. You think this Crenshaw would try to kill Adelaide to force you to sell?" Xander's voice was carefully neutral, but Adelaide could hear the anger simmering beneath the surface. "I think Silas Crenshaw is capable of just about anything if it serves his purposes. The man's ruthless, and he's got money and hired guns to back him up." Marcus looked at Adelaide, worry etched deep in the lines of his face. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. If I had known you were in any danger, I never would have agreed to let you visit. It's not your fault, Uncle Marcus. And maybe it wasn't this Crenshaw person at all. Maybe it really was just random." But even as Adelaide said the words, she didn't quite believe them. The timing, as Xander had pointed out, was too convenient. "Either way, we need to be careful until we know for sure," Marcus said. He turned to Xander. "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. You saved my niece's life, and I'm in your service if you ever need anything." Xander shifted uncomfortably, clearly not used to such formal gratitude. "I just did what anyone would have done. But you're the one who did it." Marcus stood and extended his hand, and Xander shook it firmly. "You'll stay for dinner at least. It's the least we can offer." Adelaide found herself holding her breath, waiting for Xander's answer. She wasn't ready for him to leave yet, wasn't ready to say goodbye to the man who had risked his life for hers, who had looked at her with those intense blue eyes and said she was worth it. "I'd be honored," Xander said, and Adelaide released the breath she had been holding. Dinner that evening was a lively affair, with Adelaide getting to meet the various ranch hands who worked for her uncle and hearing their stories of life on the triple bar. Xander fit in easily with the group, clearly respected despite being from a different ranch, and Adelaide found herself watching him across the table, admiring the way he laughed at someone's joke or listened intently when one of the younger hands was speaking. After the meal, Marcus invited Xander to stay the night rather than ride back to the barn in the dark, and again, Xander accepted. Adelaide tried not to read too much into the way her heart lifted at the news that he would be staying longer. She found him later that evening on the porch, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that glowed softly in the moonlight. He didn't turn when she approached, but she saw his shoulders relax slightly, as if he had known it was her. "Beautiful night," Adelaide said softly, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "It is. Hard to believe this is the same place that was trying to kill us yesterday." Adelaide smiled at that. "The mountains are moody, beautiful one moment, deadly the next." "Kind of like certain women I've met," Xander said, and there was something teasing in his tone that made Adelaide's smile widen. "Are you calling me deadly, Mr. Lawson?" "I'm calling you dangerous," he corrected, finally turning to look at her. "Though maybe not in the way you're thinking." Adelaide's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. They were standing close enough that she could see the faint stubble on his jaw and the way the moonlight reflected in his eyes, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cold night air. "What way am I dangerous?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Xander reached up and gently tucked a strand of hair that had escaped from her braid behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. "The kind of dangerous that makes a man forget all his common sense. The kind that makes him think about things he has no business thinking about." "What kind of things?" Adelaide's heart was hammering now, and she couldn't look away from his eyes. "Things like how brave you were hanging from that cliff. How you didn't complain once during the whole ride, even though I know you must have been freezing and sore. How your eyes light up when you're arguing a point you believe in." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower. "Things like how much I'd like to kiss you right now, even though I met you less than 2 days ago and you're way out of my league." Adelaide reached up and placed her hand over his where it still rested against her cheek. "You saved my life, Xander. If anything, I'm the one who's out of her league here. Adelaide, I'm a ranch hand with nothing to my name but a horse and a saddle. You're Marcus Lancaster's niece from Denver, educated and refined. We're from different worlds." "Maybe I don't want to be from that world anymore," Adelaide said fiercely. "Maybe I came out here looking for something real, something that matters. And maybe I found it hanging from a cliff while a cowboy I'd never met risked everything to save me." Xander's hand moved to cup her face fully, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "You don't know what you're saying. You've been through a trauma and you're confused." "I'm not confused," Adelaide insisted. "I've never been more clear about anything in my life. When I was hanging from that cliff, all I could think about was all the things I'd never done, all the risks I'd never taken because I was too busy being proper and respectable. And then you appeared like something out of a dream and gave me a second chance at life. I don't want to waste it." "Adelaide." Her name was almost a groan on his lips. "Kiss me, Xander, please." For a long moment he just looked at her, something like wonder and desire and fear warring in his expression. Then he lowered his head and kissed her, soft and tentative at first, as if he was afraid she might break. But when Adelaide pressed closer and wound her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent and real and absolutely perfect. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "This is crazy," he whispered. "I know," Adelaide whispered back, "but I don't care." They stood there in the moonlight, holding each other, and Adelaide felt something shift and settle in her chest, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. She had come west looking for freedom, for something different, for a life of her own choosing. She had found all that and more in the form of a dark-haired cowboy with blue eyes and a hero's heart. The next morning, Xander prepared to return to the bar, and Adelaide walked him out to where his horse was saddled and waiting. Marcus had already thanked him again and extended an open invitation to visit the Triple Bar any time, and the other ranch hands had clapped him on the back and called him a hero. But Adelaide had hung back, waiting for a private moment to say her own goodbye. "When will I see you again?" she asked, trying not to sound as desperate as she felt. "I don't know. I've got work to do and you need to spend time with your uncle." Xander's expression was conflicted, as if he was wrestling with himself. "Adelaide, about last night, we should probably talk about that." Adelaide's heart sank. "You're going to tell me it was a mistake. I'm going to tell you we should take things slow, get to know each other properly, give you time to be sure about what you want." "I already know what I want." Xander smiled slightly at that, but there was sadness in it too. "You think you do. But you've been here less than a week, and most of that time you were nearly dying or recovering from nearly dying. That's not a good foundation for making life decisions. So what are you saying? That we should forget last night happened. No, Xander said firmly. He reached out and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. I'm saying we should be smart about this. I'll come visit when I can, and we'll spend time together, and we'll see where this goes. But I'm not going to rush you into anything or take advantage of your gratitude. Adelaide wanted to argue that it wasn't gratitude she felt, that it was something much deeper and more real than that. But she could see the determination in Xander's eyes and knew that pushing him would only make him pull away further. So she nodded, even though everything in her wanted to hold on and not let him leave. When will you come back? Next Sunday, if your uncle doesn't mind. I'll have the day off and we could go riding if the weather holds. I'd like that, Adelaide said softly. Xander squeezed her hand once, then released it and swung up into his saddle. Take care of yourself, Adelaide Lancaster, and be careful. Until we know for sure what happened up on that pass, you shouldn't go anywhere alone. I'll be careful, she promised. She watched him ride out, watched until he was just a small figure in the distance, and felt her heart go with him. It was ridiculous, she told herself. She had known him for barely 2 days. These feelings couldn't possibly be real or lasting. But try as she might, she couldn't convince herself of that. What she felt for Xander Lawson was as real as the ground beneath her feet and the sky above her head. The week that followed was both wonderful and frustrating. Wonderful because Adelaide loved the triple bar and everything about life on the ranch. She loved the wide open spaces and the mountains in the distance, loved the smell of hay and horses and wood smoke, loved the simple rhythms of ranch life. Marcus was delighted to have her there and showed her around with obvious pride, introducing her to every cow and horse and patch of land as if they were old friends. But it was frustrating too because all Adelaide could think about was Xander. She found herself watching the road constantly, hoping for some glimpse of him even though she knew he wouldn't come before Sunday. She replayed their kiss on the porch over and over in her mind, remembering the feel of his hands on her face and the taste of his lips, and the way her entire body had seemed to catch fire at his touch. Marcus noticed her distraction and commented on it over dinner one evening. You've been somewhere else all week, sweetheart. Everything all right? Adelaide felt heat creep into her cheeks. I'm fine, Uncle Marcus. Just adjusting to being here. Wouldn't have anything to do with a certain cowboy who saved your life, would it? Adelaide's head jerked up, her eyes wide. How did you? Marcus chuckled. I'm old, not blind. I saw the way you two were looking at each other, and I saw you on the porch that night, though I made sure not to interrupt. Uncle Marcus. Adelaide didn't know whether to be mortified or relieved. Xander Lawson is a good man, Marcus said seriously. Honest, hardworking, decent. I've known him for a couple of years now, and I've never heard anyone say a bad word about him. But Adelaide, you need to be sure about what you're doing. A cowboy's life is hard, and it's not what you're used to. Your parents sent you here expecting you'd get some fresh air and adventure, and then go back to Denver and settle down with some merchant's son. I don't want to go back to Denver, Adelaide said quietly. I don't want to marry some merchant's son and spend my life hosting tea parties and attending charity functions. I want something real, Uncle Marcus. I want to matter. Marcus reached across the table and patted her hand gently. You matter, sweetheart. You always have. But I understand what you mean. Your father, my brother, he loves you, but he's never understood that you needed more than the life he envisioned for you. He paused, his expression thoughtful. If you want to stay here, you can. The triple bar will always be home to you if you want it to be. Tears pricked Adelaide's eyes. Thank you. That means more than you know. But, Marcus continued, you need to be honest with yourself about why you want to stay. Is it because you truly love it here, or is it because of Xander Lawson? Because if it's just because of a man, that's not enough. You need to be choosing this life for yourself, not for someone else. Adelaide thought about that for a long time that night, lying in her bed and staring at the ceiling. Was she drawn to ranch life because she genuinely wanted it, or because Xander was part of it? But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the answer was both. She had fallen in love with Colorado and the ranch before she had even met Xander. The feelings she had for him were separate from that, even if they were intertwined in her mind because of how they had met. When Sunday finally came, Adelaide was up early, too nervous and excited to sleep. She dressed carefully in her riding clothes, then changed her mind and put on a dress, then changed back to the riding clothes because Xander had said they might go riding. She was just coming down the stairs when there was a knock at the door, and her heart leaped into her throat. But it wasn't Xander at the door. It was a man Adelaide had never seen before, tall and heavy-set with graying hair and cold eyes that reminded her of chips of slate. Marcus came to the door behind her and she felt him stiffen. "Crenshaw, what brings you to the Triple Bar?" So this was Silas Crenshaw, the man who might have been responsible for shooting at her. Adelaide studied him with new wariness, noting the expensive suit that seemed out of place on a ranch, and the two men standing behind him who were clearly hired guns. "Just being neighborly, Lancaster. Heard you had some trouble last week. Thought I'd stop by and make sure everyone was all right." Crenshaw's voice was smooth as oil, but there was nothing friendly in his expression. "We're fine. No thanks to whoever was shooting up in the pass," Marcus said coolly. "Terrible thing, that. Lots of dangers up in those mountains this time of year. Easy for accidents to happen." Crenshaw's eyes slid to Adelaide and she felt her skin crawl. "This must be your niece from Denver. Adelaide, isn't it? I heard about your mishap. Lucky that Cowboy came along when he did." "Very lucky," Adelaide said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear curling in her stomach. "You know, Lancaster, this just proves my point from before. This area is getting too dangerous for decent folk. More and more drifters and outlaws coming through, taking advantage of isolated ranches. A woman like your niece shouldn't have to worry about being shot at while traveling through the countryside." Crenshaw smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "If you sold the Triple Bar to me, you could take that money and relocate somewhere safer. Denver, maybe, or back east." "I'm not selling," Marcus said flatly. "I told you that 2 months ago, and my answer hasn't changed. That's a shame. Especially now that you have your niece to think about. Wouldn't want anything else to happen to her while she's visiting." The threat was barely veiled, hanging in the air between them like smoke. Adelaide felt rage replace her fear. "Are you threatening us, Mr. Crenshaw?" "Threatening? No, of course not. Just expressing concern for your safety, but I can see you're both determined to be stubborn about this." Crenshaw tipped his hat with mocking courtesy. "I'll leave you to your Sunday, but think about what I said, Lancaster. Accidents can happen to anyone, anytime. Would be a real tragedy if something happened to that pretty niece of yours." He turned and walked back to his horse, his hired guns following. Marcus shut the door firmly and turned to Adelaide, his face grim. "That was him, wasn't it?" Adelaide said. "The man who ordered someone to shoot at me. I can't prove it, but yes, I believe it was. Silas Crenshaw wants the Triple Bar badly, and he's not the kind of man who accepts no for an answer." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly older. "I should send you back to Denver. You're not safe here." "I'm not going anywhere," Adelaide said fiercely. "I won't let that man chase me away from my own family." "Adelaide, this isn't a game. Crenshaw has killed before, I'm certain of it. He's dangerous, and if he thinks threatening you will force me to sell, he won't hesitate to follow through on those threats." Before Adelaide could respond, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Xander, looking concerned. I passed Silas Crenshaw and his men on the road. What was he doing here? Marcus quickly filled him in on the conversation, and Adelaide watched Xander's expression darken with anger. He threatened Adelaide, right to your face. Not in so many words, but the meaning was clear enough. Xander turned to Adelaide, his eyes blazing with protective fury. You need to leave. Go back to Denver where you'll be safe. That's what I told her, Marcus said. Adelaide looked between the two men, both of them ready to ship her off for her own protection, and felt her temper flare. I'm not leaving. This is my home now, and I won't be driven away by some bully with money and hired guns. Adelaide, be reasonable, Xander started. No, you be reasonable. What's to stop Crenshaw from going after Uncle Marcus once I'm gone, or burning down the ranch, or any of a dozen other things? Running away doesn't solve anything. But it keeps you alive, Xander said roughly. He crossed to her and took her by the shoulders, his grip gentle but firm. Don't you understand? If anything happened to you, I couldn't. He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Please, go back to Denver. Adelaide reached up and placed her hands over his where they rested on her shoulders. I can't, I won't. This is where I'm meant to be, Xander. I feel it in my bones, and I'm not going to let Silas Crenshaw take that away from me. Marcus cleared his throat, reminding them they weren't alone. Adelaide's right that leaving won't solve the underlying problem. Crenshaw will just keep pushing until he gets what he wants, and if threatening Adelaide doesn't work, he'll find some other lever to use against me. He sighed heavily. But I don't like putting you in danger, sweetheart. Then we need to figure out how to stop him, Adelaide said. There must be something we can do. Can we go to the law? Sheriff's office is in Delta, and the sheriff is on Crenshaw's payroll, Marcus said bitterly. He won't lift a finger against the man who pays his bribes. What about the territorial marshal? Xander suggested. If we can prove Crenshaw's behind the shooting and the threats, a federal officer might be willing to step in. Proving it is the problem. We have no evidence, just suspicions and veiled threats. Marcus moved to his desk and pulled out a piece of paper. But maybe we can get evidence. If Crenshaw's men are responsible for the shooting, they might try again. And if we're ready for them, we might be able to catch them in the act. You want to use Adelaide as bait, Xander said, his voice hard. No. I want to make it look like Adelaide is vulnerable when she's actually well protected. We announce that Adelaide is going into town for supplies, make sure word gets around. Crenshaw's men will see it as an opportunity to strike. But we'll have men hidden along the road, ready to intervene and catch them in the act. It's too dangerous, Xander said flatly. It's a good plan, Adelaide countered. And I'm willing to do it if it means stopping Crenshaw. Of course you are, Xander said, and there was something like despair in his voice. You're brave and stubborn and willing to risk your neck for what's right. But Adelaide, I just found you. I'm not ready to lose you. The raw emotion in his words made Adelaide's breath catch. She looked up at him, seeing the fear and love mixed together in his eyes, and felt her heart swell. You're not going to lose me. I trust you to keep me safe. The way I kept you safe from that cliff. Xander's voice was bitter. I was barely in time then, Adelaide. I might not be so lucky next time. You weren't lucky. You were skilled and brave and exactly where you needed to be. Adelaide cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I trust you, Xander Lawson, with my life. Do you trust me? He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. With everything I have. Then let's do this, together. It took 2 days to set up the plan. Marcus sent word into Delta through one of his trusted hands that Adelaide would be making the trip into town on Wednesday to do some shopping and visit the dressmaker. The story was that she was planning to stay at the Triple Bar for an extended period and needed new clothes suitable for ranch life. It was close enough to the truth that no one would question it. On Wednesday morning, Adelaide dressed in her warmest traveling clothes and tried to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. Xander had arrived at dawn, along with 3 of Marcus's most trusted ranch hands. They would be positioned at strategic points along the road to Delta, hidden but ready to intervene if anyone tried anything. "Remember," Marcus said as he helped Adelaide into the wagon that would carry her to town, "at the first sign of trouble, you get down and stay down. Let the men handle it." "I will," Adelaide promised, though she had her uncle's pistol tucked into her coat pocket just in case. Xander rode up beside the wagon on his bay gelding, his expression grim but determined. "I'll be right behind you the whole way. You won't be able to see me, but I'll be there." Adelaide nodded, drawing comfort from his presence even if she couldn't see him. The ranch hand who would be driving the wagon, a grizzled veteran named Tom who Marcus trusted implicitly, clicked to the horses and they started down the road toward Delta. The first few miles passed without incident. The day was clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue overhead, and under other circumstances, Adelaide would have enjoyed the journey. But she was wound tight with tension, her eyes scanning the landscape constantly for any sign of danger. They were about halfway to town, passing through a narrow section of road flanked by rocky outcroppings on one side and a steep drop-off on the other when it happened. A shot rang out, and one of the wagon horses screamed and reared. Tom fought to control the team while Adelaide gripped the seat and tried to stay upright. "Get down," Tom shouted, and Adelaide dove for the floor of the wagon just as another shot whizzed overhead. More gunfire erupted, but this time it was coming from multiple directions as Marcus's hidden men returned fire. Adelaide crouched in the wagon bed, her heart hammering, and pulled out the pistol with shaking hands. Through a gap in the wagon's sideboards, she could see men on horseback emerging from behind the rocks, firing as they came. Then Xander was there, his horse thundering past the wagon toward the attackers. Adelaide watched in terror as he rode straight into the gunfire, his own pistol drawn and firing with deadly accuracy. One of the attackers went down, then another, and the rest began to retreat, but one of them broke away from the group and headed straight for the wagon. Adelaide saw him coming, saw the cold determination in his eyes, and knew he meant to finish what he had started. She raised her pistol with both hands the way her uncle had taught her years ago and fired. The shot went wide, but it was close enough to make the man's horse shy. It bought Xander the time he needed to intercept, and he tackled the man right off his horse. They went down hard, rolling across the snowy ground, and Adelaide's heart was in her throat as she watched them struggle. The fight was brutal and short. Xander landed a solid punch that left the other man dazed, then hauled him to his feet and pressed his gun to the man's temple. "Don't move," he growled, and the man went still. The other attackers had fled, but Marcus's men had managed to catch 2 more. As the dust settled, Adelaide climbed shakily out of the wagon and looked at the carnage. 2 men dead, 3 captured, and miraculously, no one on their side seriously injured. Xander secured his prisoner and immediately came to Adelaide's side. "Are you hurt? Did they hit you?" "I'm fine," Adelaide managed, though she was shaking from head to foot. "I'm all right." Xander pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, and Adelaide felt the tremors running through his body. "When I saw that man heading for you, I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence, just held her tighter. Marcus rode up with the other ranch hands, looking at the captured men with grim satisfaction. "Let's get these 3 back to the Triple Bar and see what they have to say for themselves. With any luck, they'll be willing to talk about who hired them in exchange for leniency." The captured men were, in fact, very willing to talk once they realized the alternative, was being turned over to the territorial marshal for attempted murder. They confirmed what everyone already suspected. Silas Crenshaw had hired them to kill Adelaide, hoping that her death would break Marcus's spirit and force him to sell the triple bar. Armed with signed confessions and witnesses to the attack, Marcus sent word to the territorial marshal's office in Denver. The marshal himself arrived 3 days later, arrested Silas Crenshaw and several of his associates, and promised that justice would be served. With Crenshaw in custody and his hired guns either dead or arrested, the threat that had been hanging over the triple bar lifted. Life began to return to normal, though Adelaide found that her definition of normal had changed considerably since arriving in Colorado. She had changed too. The frightened girl who had clung to that juniper root seemed like someone from a different lifetime. Adelaide felt stronger now, more confident in her own abilities and judgment. She had faced death multiple times and survived. She had helped capture the men who wanted to kill her. She had found a home and a purpose, and a love that filled her heart to overflowing. Xander had become a regular presence at the triple bar, visiting whenever his work at the bar allowed. Marcus had offered him a job as foreman, and after some consideration, Xander had accepted. He moved into the foreman's cabin in early February, and Adelaide's heart sang every time she saw him riding across the ranch, checking on cattle or fixing fences, or doing any of the 100 tasks that kept a ranch running. They courted properly, with Marcus's blessing and the ranch hand's good-natured teasing. Xander took Adelaide riding through the mountains, showing her hidden valleys and secret places he had discovered during his years in Colorado. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams and fears. And they kissed whenever they could steal a private moment, kisses that grew deeper and more passionate as the weeks passed. On a clear evening in late March, with the snow melting and the first signs of spring appearing in patches of green grass, Xander asked Adelaide to take a walk with him after dinner. They wandered away from the ranch buildings, following the creek that ran through the property, until they reached a spot where the water pooled into a small pond that reflected the twilight sky. "This is beautiful," Adelaide said softly, taking in the peaceful scene. "I've been thinking about building a house here," Xander said, his voice carefully casual. "It's good land with water access and a nice view of the mountains, room for a garden, maybe some chickens. A good place to raise a family." Adelaide's heart started to beat faster. "It sounds wonderful." "Adelaide." Xander turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I know we haven't known each other very long, just a few months, but they've been the best months of my life, and I can't imagine spending another day without you." He took a deep breath, and Adelaide saw that his hands were shaking slightly. "I don't have much to offer you. I'm just a ranch foreman with a modest salary and big dreams. But I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I promise I'll spend every day of my life trying to make you happy if you'll let me." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small box. Inside was a simple gold ring with a single small diamond that caught the fading light. "Adelaide Lancaster, will you marry me?" Tears were streaming down Adelaide's face, but she was smiling so wide it almost hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, Xander, of course I'll marry you." Xander let out a breath he seemed to have been holding and slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a joy and passion that made Adelaide's head spin. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "You're sure about this? About me, about this life? Because once you marry a cowboy, there's no going back to fancy parties and city life." "I don't want to go back," Adelaide said firmly. I want to move forward with you, building a life together right here. This is where I belong, Xander. With you on this land under these mountains. I've never been more sure of anything." They were married 6 weeks later, in early May, when the wildflowers were blooming across the meadows, and the mountains were still capped with snow. Adelaide wore a simple white dress that the dressmaker in Delta had created especially for her, and Xander wore his best suit with a string tie and polished boots. Marcus walked Adelaide down the aisle that had been set up in the ranch yard, his eyes suspiciously bright, and gave her away with obvious pride and just a touch of sadness. The ceremony was officiated by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Delta, and it was attended by everyone from the Triple Bar and the Bar M, plus half the town of Delta. The whole community had fallen in love with the story of the cowboy who had rescued the city girl from a snowy cliff, and they all wanted to witness the happy ending. As Xander slipped the wedding band onto Adelaide's finger beside her engagement ring, she looked up into his blue eyes and remembered that terrible, wonderful moment when he had reached down from the cliff edge and told her he had her, that she was going to be all right. He had been right then, and he was right now. Everything was going to be all right, better than all right, because they were together. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher said with a broad smile. "You may kiss your bride." And Xander did, thoroughly and enthusiastically, to the whoops and applause of everyone gathered. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, Adelaide felt happiness bubbling up inside her like champagne. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than Adelaide had ever seen in one place. She danced with Xander and Marcus and Tom and half a dozen other ranch hands, but she always came back to her husband, drawn to him like a magnet to true north. Late that night, Xander carried her across the threshold of the small house he had built by the pond, the one they would share as husband and wife. It wasn't fancy, just 4 rooms and a porch, but Adelaide loved every inch of it because it was theirs. Xander set her down gently in the main room, which was furnished simply but comfortably, and pulled her back into his arms. "Hello, Mrs. Lawson," he said softly, and Adelaide's heart swelled at the sound of her new name. "Hello, Mr. Lawson," she replied, wrapping her arms around his neck. "Have I mentioned how much I love you? A few times today, but I don't mind hearing it again." "I love you," Adelaide said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "I love you so much it sometimes scares me. When I think about how close I came to dying on that cliff, how easily I could have never met you." "But you didn't die," Xander interrupted gently. "You held on and I found you, and here we are. That's all that matters now." "You risked everything to save me that day," Adelaide said, remembering how he had climbed out over that cliff, how one wrong move could have killed them both. Xander cupped her face in his hands, his eyes intense and loving. "You're worth it, Adelaide. You were worth it then, and you're worth it now, and you'll be worth it every single day for the rest of our lives. I'd risk everything for you 1,000 times over and never regret it." Adelaide kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude and joy into it, and Xander responded with equal passion. They stayed up late into the night, talking and laughing and exploring this new chapter of their life together, and Adelaide thought she had never been happier. The years that followed were good ones. Xander proved to be an excellent foreman, and under his management, the Triple Bar prospered. Adelaide threw herself into ranch life with enthusiasm, learning to rope and brand and do all the tasks that kept a ranch running. She also started a vegetable garden by their house that became the envy of the county, and began teaching some of the ranch hands' children to read and write in a small schoolhouse that Marcus helped her build. In the spring of 1886, Adelaide gave birth to their first child, a healthy boy they named Marcus Xander Lawson in honor of Adelaide's uncle. The baby had his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, and both parents were completely besotted with him from the first moment. Marcus Sr. was equally delighted with his namesake and great-nephew, and spent hours rocking the baby and telling him stories about the old days. Adelaide watched her uncle with the child and felt her heart fill with love for this family they had built together. In 1888, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Rose. She came into the world squalling and red-faced and absolutely perfect, with her mother's delicate features and her father's stubborn determination. Young Marcus, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and spent hours watching her with wide, serious eyes. Life wasn't always easy. There were hard winters and dry summers, years when the cattle prices fell and money was tight. There were illnesses and injuries and all the normal struggles of ranch life. But through it all, Adelaide and Xander faced everything together, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. Adelaide's parents came to visit when Marcus was a year old, and while they were initially horrified by their daughter's rough and rural lifestyle, they couldn't deny that she was happy. Her mother fretted about Adelaide's sun-browned skin and work-worn hands, but her father took Xander aside and told him that any man who could make his daughter smile like that was all right in his book. The relationship with her parents remained somewhat strained, but they made their peace with Adelaide's choices, especially after they met their grandchildren. Adelaide's mother declared that Marcus was the most beautiful baby she had ever seen, and she softened considerably toward the life her daughter had chosen. In the summer of 1890, when Marcus was 4 and Clara was 2, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant again. This time, she gave birth to twin boys in the early spring of 1891. They named them Thomas James and William Henry, and the household descended into cheerful chaos trying to keep up with 4 young children. Xander proved to be a wonderful father, patient and loving, and never too tired to play with his children or tell them stories. Adelaide would often find him in the barn with all 4 children trailing after him, helping with the chores in ways that usually made more work but filled everyone with joy. Marcus Sr. remained a constant presence in their lives, dividing his time between the main house and Xander and Adelaide's home by the pond. As he grew older, he gradually handed more and more of the ranch's management over to Xander, until finally, in 1893, he officially retired and made Xander a full partner in the Triple Bar. "You've earned this 100 times over," Marcus told Xander when they signed the partnership papers. "You've been like a son to me, and I can't think of anyone I'd rather have running this place." Xander was deeply moved by the gesture, and Adelaide watched with tears in her eyes as her husband and her uncle embraced. She thought about how far they had all come from that terrible, wonderful day on the snowy cliff, and marveled at the strange and beautiful ways that life could unfold. The children grew like weeds, healthy and strong and full of spirit. Marcus Jr. showed signs of having his father's way with horses, able to gentle even the most difficult animals with patience and kindness. Clara was brilliant and curious, always asking questions and wanting to know how things worked. The twins were inseparable and mischievous, constantly getting into trouble but so charming that it was hard to stay mad at them for long. In 1895, Adelaide gave birth to one more child, a daughter they named Margaret Ellen after both their mothers. She was a sweet-tempered baby who rarely cried and seemed content to watch the world with calm, observant eyes. "5 children," Xander said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, Margaret asleep in Adelaide's arms and the other children playing in the yard. "We've built quite a family." "We have," Adelaide agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Sometimes I can hardly believe this is my life, that I get to wake up every morning in this beautiful place with you and our children, doing work that matters and surrounded by people I love." "No regrets about leaving Denver and all that fancy city life behind," Adelaide laughed. "Not a single one. This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Xander kissed the top of her head, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "I still think about that day sometimes, you know. Seeing you hanging from that cliff, thinking I might be too late. It was the worst and best moment of my life all at once." "Best?" Adelaide questioned, tilting her head to look up at him. "Because it brought you to me. Because in that moment, I knew I'd found something worth fighting for, worth living for. You changed my life that day, Adelaide, just as much as I changed yours." "We saved each other," Adelaide said softly. "You saved my life, and I saved your heart from the loneliness it had been carrying." Xander had told her, years ago, about the darkness that had followed him after his parents' death, the feeling of being adrift and alone in the world. He had thrown himself into work to escape the pain, moving from ranch to ranch, never putting down roots or letting anyone get too close. Until a city girl with gray eyes and fierce determination had crashed into his life and changed everything. "I love you," Xander said, the words as heartfelt as they had been the first time he said them all those years ago. "I will love you until the day I die and probably long after that." "I love you too," Adelaide replied. "Always." As the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Adelaide looked out at the life they had built together and felt profound gratitude. She thought about the frightened girl who had hung from a cliff in a snowstorm, certain she was going to die. That girl had been given a second chance at life, and Adelaide had made the most of it. She had found love and purpose and a home in the most unexpected way. She had built a family and a life that was far richer than anything she could have imagined back in Denver. And it had all started with a cowboy who had risked everything to save her life and told her she was worth it. The years continued to pass in a blur of happiness and hard work. The children grew and flourished, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Marcus Jr. took over more and more of the ranch operations as he got older, showing a natural talent for leadership and management. Clara went to college in Denver, one of the first women in the family to pursue higher education, and came back with a degree in teaching. The twins went into business together, starting a successful horse breeding operation on land adjacent to the Triple Bar. And Margaret, the baby of the family, surprised everyone by becoming a veterinarian, one of the few women in the profession. Adelaide and Xander watched their children grow and leave and build their own lives with a mixture of pride and bittersweet nostalgia. But they were never alone for long. The children came back often, bringing spouses and eventually grandchildren, filling the house by the pond with noise and laughter and love. Marcus Sr. passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1902, at the age of 78. He was buried on a hill overlooking the Triple Bar, and Adelaide placed wildflowers on his grave and thanked him for giving her a home and a chance at a different life. Without his willingness to welcome her to Colorado, she never would have met Xander, never would have found this life she loved so much. Adelaide and Xander grew old together, their love deepening with each passing year. They celebrated their 25th anniversary in 1909 with a big party that brought together family and friends from all over Colorado. Their 40th anniversary in 1924 was a quieter affair, just the two of them and their children and grandchildren, but it was no less meaningful. On a warm summer evening in 1927, when Adelaide was 65 and Xander was 68. They sat together on the porch of their house by the pond, holding hands and watching the sunset just as they had done countless times over the past 42 years. "You remember the day we met?" Adelaide asked, though of course she knew he did. They had told the story so many times to their children and grandchildren that it had taken on the quality of legend. "Every detail," Xander replied, his voice still strong despite his years. "The way the snow was falling, the sound of your scream, the fear in your eyes when I looked down and saw you hanging there. The absolute determination on your face when you reached for the rope. The way you looked at me after you pulled me up," Adelaide added. "Like I was something precious and worth protecting. You were. You are." Xander squeezed her hand gently. "You're still the bravest person I've ever known, Adelaide Lawson, still the most beautiful, even with all these gray hairs." He tugged gently on one of the silver strands that had long since replaced her auburn hair. Adelaide laughed. "You're not exactly the dark-haired young cowboy I met on that cliff anymore either." "We've gotten old," Xander said, but there was no sadness in his voice, only acceptance and contentment. "We have. But we've done it together, and that makes all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. In the distance, they could see some of their grandchildren playing in the yard, their shouts of laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The Triple Bar continued to thrive under Marcus Jr.'s management, and Adelaide knew it would continue for generations to come. "Would you do it all again?" Xander asked suddenly. "If you could go back to that day in 1884, knowing everything you know now, would you still get on that horse and head into the mountains?" Adelaide didn't even have to think about it. "Yes, 1,000 times yes, because that journey, terrifying as it was, led me to you. And you, Xander Lawson, have been the greatest gift of my life." Xander raised her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "The feeling is entirely mutual, Mrs. Lawson." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Adelaide leaned her head on Xander's shoulder and thought about the incredible journey her life had been. From a sheltered girl in Denver to a woman hanging from a cliff in a blizzard to a wife and mother and rancher who had built a life beyond her wildest dreams. It had all started with a gunshot and a scream and a cowboy who had risked everything to save her. She had told him he risked everything that day, and he had responded that she was worth it. But the truth was, they had both taken a risk on each other. She had trusted him to save her life, and he had trusted her with his heart. And together, they had built something beautiful and lasting, a love story that would be told and retold in their family for generations to come. The stars grew brighter overhead, scattered across the vast Colorado sky like diamonds on velvet. Adelaide closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of sage and pine, listened to the sound of the creek babbling over stones and the distant lowing of cattle. This was home. This was love. This was the life she had chosen and fought for and built with her own 2 hands alongside the man she loved. And it was absolutely perfect. When they finally went inside that night, walking slowly but steadily, their hands still clasped together, Adelaide looked back one last time at the mountains silhouetted against the starry sky. Somewhere up there was the cliff where she had nearly died, where Xander had pulled her back from the edge and changed both their lives forever. She sent a silent thank you to that younger version of herself, the girl who had been brave enough to let go of that juniper root and trust in a stranger's promise. That decision, made in a moment of desperation and faith, had led to 42 years of love and happiness and purpose. As Xander closed the door behind them and pulled her into his arms for a goodnight kiss, Adelaide smiled against his lips. They had been through so much together, survived so many challenges, and celebrated so many joys. And through it all, the love that had sparked to life on a snowy mountainside had never faltered or dimmed. They went to bed that night wrapped in each other's arms, just as they had for over 4 decades, and Adelaide drifted off to sleep feeling grateful and blessed and deeply, profoundly loved. The cowboy had rescued her from snowy cliffs all those years ago, but the truth was, they had rescued each other. And together, they had built a life worth living, a love worth celebrating, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. The end.